Today we're going to be taking a look at a true chess masterpiece, played by the great Bobby Fischer when he was only 13 years old. And it's one that I'll go so far as to call the greatest game played by an American prodigy in the 20th century. Many have gone much further. It's been called the game of the century without qualification, but wherever you stand on this milestone of chess history, or however many times you've seen it analyzed before, after watching this video, you will almost certainly gain a deeper appreciation for some of the more ingenious subtleties behind the moves of both players. I'm going to be covering some fascinating and critical variations that there's a good chance you haven't seen elsewhere, and which will demonstrate that in addition to Bobby Fischer's astounding creativity and precision in this game, the creation of this chess masterpiece would not have been possible without some brilliant play by his opponent as well. And what an opponent it was. One of the strongest masters in the entire country and a former US Open champion, the 26-year-old Donald Byrne, who in this epic encounter from October of 1956 at the Marshall Chess Club in New York City and playing with the white pieces, opens the game with knight to f3. A move which allows black to open with pretty much any move he wants to, with the exception of e5, as that would lose a pawn. Bobby goes for the symmetrical knight to f6. Donald responds c4, transposing into an English opening. Now Bobby could settle in English territory now with the move c5, but he goes for g6, preparing a bishop fianchetto, giving Donald the opportunity to steer the game into a queen's pawn opening now with d4, but he plays knight to c3, again inviting c5. Bobby just plays his bishop to g7, once again throwing the ball back to Donald, saying, I'll just let you call the opening shots. You want e4, d4? I don't care. So we do have d4, but once again, this gives Bobby options. He could initiate the Grunfeld with the move d5, or the King's Indian with d6, but Bobby is still not ready to make a commitment with his central pawns and simply castles. So it seems like each player is saying, I can play any opening against you, so go ahead, take the game where you will. Is this a conscious psychological ploy? Who knows? But Donald now continues to play in a non-committal way with the move bishop to f4, which has never been a real popular move in this position. It's much more common to put the bishop on g5, preventing black from immediately playing d5 by attacking one of that square's defenders. But Donald, being committed to his non-commitment, is once again allowing Bobby flexibility with that d-pawn. He could play d6, but Bobby now finally decides on d5, officially entering the Grunfeld. Donald continues queen to b3, threatening to win the d-pawn, thereby inviting Bobby to trade it off with the move d takes c4, which is what he now does, only because it comes with a tempo on the white queen. If white had played the more common e3 instead of queen to b3, then this capture would not be advisable, since white could recapture with bishop takes c4, developing a piece to an active square. But here, white has to move his queen a second time with queen takes c4, and Bobby's going to try to make the case that he is compensated for his loss of central influence by the fact that white has lost a little bit of time moving his queen twice. And also that on c4, the white queen will be subject to attack in the near future. But first, Bobby addresses the threat to his c7 pawn, which is now hit twice. He plays c6. It's as good a move as any, controlling d5, controlling b5, opening a diagonal for his queen. We have e4, of course, achieving that dream pawn center. Bobby continues knight b to d7, a move which neither the engine nor modern-day theory is very partial to, instead preferring some rapid queenside expansion with moves like b5, a5, maybe b4 to undermine the defense of e4. An immediate queen to a5, pinning the c3 knight, is good as well. But back in 1956, the opening theory hadn't been so thoroughly developed, and so Bobby's move knight b to d7 probably seemed pretty reasonable. He's planning knight to b6 with tempo on the white queen, but after rook to d1 from Donald, supporting the center while placing a rook opposite the black queen, generally a good thing to do, and knight to b6 from Bobby, if white were to now continue with the strongest move, queen to b3, then it's not so clear what compensation black has for white's big dominating center and his own lack of space. The b-pawn is now blocked, so is the move queen to a5, and black's position is just a bit miserable. Not despondent, but a tad morose, with the engine giving a nice positional plus to white. But Donald rejects the best move, queen to b3. Maybe he didn't like the looks of bishop to e6 with tempo on the queen, but after queen to c2, black's positional ailments have not been cured. What's played in the game, though, is queen to c5, which is not accurate and pretty much gives away white's entire advantage to the move Bobby plays next, bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the rook, looking to possibly play bishop takes f3, compromising white's kingside pawn structure. Now, if the white queen were on b3 here, then bishop to e2 would keep a nice advantage for white. But with the queen sitting on c5, it's a different story. Although bishop to e2 is probably still the best move, Donald rejected it, probably due to the following sequence available to black. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and knight f to d7, attacking white's queen. And after it moves, let's say to a5, black has the move e5, which will force a central pawn trade because of the fact that it also attacks the bishop on f4, thereby reducing white's proud pawn center by 50%. So this only works for black because white had to expend a move retreating his queen from c5. Otherwise, he could have just played bishop to e3 on his previous move and then pushed d5 here. But at this point, best for white is probably d takes e5, to which black will respond queen to e7 and then pick up the pawn on the next move, with a practically equal position. So Donald, apparently seeing this resource available to black, in the game, after Bobby's bishop to g4, comes up with a move that he thinks is a good way to deal with it. He plays bishop to g5, which on the surface looks logical. He's eyeing e7, so if Bobby were to now take on f3 and then play knight f to d7, then the e-pawn simply falls to queen takes e7, and he couldn't push that pawn anyway since he would just lose his queen. So while bishop to g5 does eliminate black's prospects for playing e5, it should nevertheless be regarded with suspicion as it breaks one of the general opening rules that says don't move your pieces twice in the opening, i.e. bishop to f4, then to g5. Bishop to e2 was much better since white really needs to work towards castling. But after bishop to g5, how does black actually punish white for his flagrant violation of opening rules? If you've never seen this game, well then first of all, I'm jealous since you're about to see one of the most incredible tactical sequences in the entire history of chess. Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like and study the position. Black has but one winning move here, and I think it's a move that very few players would ever even consider. I'm sure that it came as an utter shock to Donald Byrne, as it did to the entire chess world, as the 13-year-old Bobby Fischer busts out the stunning knight to a4. Such an odd-looking move, putting the knight on the rim, attacking the white queen from a square that at first glance looks like it's completely off limits. I mean, isn't knight takes a4 just a free knight? Well, not exactly, or even remotely. Donald declines this capture since it would remove defense from the pawn on e4, and so would allow Fischer to play knight takes e4, forking queen and bishop. And incredibly, despite having a lot of defensive options here, white is hopelessly lost. So I'm just going to run through the most important variations as briefly as I can, since I think it's the only way to really demonstrate just what an awesome feat of calculation this was by the young Bobby Fischer, who had to know that white is losing in every line. Okay, so first things first. If the white queen doesn't maintain her defense of the bishop on g5, then there's just going to be bishop takes f3, followed by knight takes g5, regaining the piece, leaving white a pawn down with a shattered and losing position. So the most obvious try is queen takes e7. This will be met with queen to a5 check, hitting both bishop and knight. So if knight to c3, then you can take on f3 and then take on g5. White could try b4, but after queen takes a4, if queen takes e4, then there's rook f to e8, pinning the queen to the king. If white blocks with knight to e5, then black has queen takes d1, checkmate. And if bishop to e7, then there's bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and bishop to f8, winning the pinned bishop, leaving white with the still centralized king, a shattered pawn structure, and no hope of survival. Okay, next option. After knight takes e4, white could try taking on e7 with the bishop, which just might be the best try, but it still leads to utter hopelessness after knight takes queen on c5, bishop takes queen on d8, rook to e8 check, bishop blocks, black takes knight on a4, the bishop on d8 moves to safety, but after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and knight takes b2, white is again a pawn down with a hideous pawn structure, king in the center. If rook to b1, then there's just bishop takes d4 defending the knight, and it's all over. Okay, moving on to queen to c1, defending the bishop that way. Here we have bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen to a5 check, again attacking both knight and bishop. So if knight to c3, there's knight takes g5, and if bishop to d2, then there's knight takes d2, followed by queen takes a4. And I should mention that in most of these lines, black does have alternative ways to win. I'm just showing the variations that I consider to be the prettiest and the cleanest. But let's press on to our final defensive option for white after knight takes e4, which is queen to b4, defending against queen to a5 check. But here we have knight takes g5, knight takes g5, bishop takes d1, king takes d1, after which black will pick up the pawn on d4 with the bishop, and with the threat of a nasty discovered check, he can do it right away, although the engine says that playing b5 first is even more crushing. Either way, white is completely finished with his slight material deficit and horrendously exposed king. So there you have it, your essential variations after white's acceptance of the sacrificed knight on a4 and black's response knight takes e4, which in the game Donald Byrne could see was no ticket to freedom and so simply retreated his attacked queen to a3, which is the top engine move. Bobby continues knight takes c3, after which queen takes c3 would walk into a fork with knight takes e4, no reason to allow that, hence the recapture b takes c3 from Donald. Bobby now picks up the pawn on e4, threatening knight takes g5, followed by bishop takes rook on d1. So the bishop on g5 really needs to move. If you play something like bishop to e3, then there's just bishop takes f3, again shattering the white pawn structure, and with his extra pawn, black should have no trouble converting. So Donald decides he needs to try to mix things up by now playing bishop takes e7, which on the surface looks like it might even be a winner, forking queen and rook. But Bobby has foreseen that, and after his response queen to b6, if Donald were to now capture the rook with bishop takes f8, then after bishop takes f8 hitting the queen, and then a move like queen to b3 for example, then Bobby would have this tactical shot knight takes c3. When the knight is immune from recapture, since queen takes c3 would lose the queen to bishop to b4, pinning her to the king. So the white rook is hit, and if you move it anywhere, then black has rook to e8 with check, and the white king starts to get into trouble. So best for white here would be to just get those queens off the board with queen takes b6, a takes b6, and then rook to a1. But after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and bishop to g7, black's going to pick up the d pawn, equalizing the material count, and then will win easily by targeting white's terribly weak remaining pawns and or pushing his own passed pawn. So Donald, realizing that this leads to certain doom, wisely declines capturing the rook on f8 and instead plays a move that I consider to be very brilliant. Despite the fact that it's losing, as all of his moves are, he plays bishop to c4, which is the engine's top choice, and it's a move that almost wins, and probably would have against any lesser player, which makes this a perfect example of how the creation of a chess masterpiece such as this usually requires brilliancies from both players, not just the winning side. So what's the deal with this move bishop to c4? Well, obviously it puts white one move away from castling, so that's a good thing, but I believe Donald was already anticipating the move that Bobby plays next, knight takes c3, clearing the e-file, so that if white were to play queen takes c3, then a rook would come to e8, and black would end up winning the pinned bishop on e7. But Donald has his response ready now with the move bishop to c5, getting his bishop out of danger while attacking the black queen. Bobby throws in a check with rook f to e8, why not? But after king to f1, I think that the vast majority of non-chess geniuses would assess this position as looking pretty dismal for black. I mean, the piece count is equal for the moment, but white is threatening both bishop takes queen and queen takes knight on c3, to which there seems to be no good defense. And this is where the brilliance of the move bishop to c4 comes into play, because if Donald had moved that bishop anywhere else, then Bobby could get out of this predicament with the move knight to b5, counterattacking white's queen. And this would be winning for black if not for the move bishop takes f7 check. to which black should respond king to h8, allowing white to capture the rook on e8, and after knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, and pawn takes bishop, white emerges the exchange up, and despite still having a few problems with his position, it's going to be black who is fighting for the draw. But the more critical variation here is, of course, king takes f7, which runs into the following variation that Bobby Fischer later mentioned in his own analysis. Queen to b3 check, getting the queen out of danger while leaving black's queen still attacked, so the only hope for black here is going to be bishop to e6, again attacking the white queen, but after knight to g5 check, king to g8, since king to f6 would run into queen to f3 check, knight takes e6, threatening a discovery while still attacking the black queen. Here black can only try knight takes d4, again attacking the white queen, but after knight takes d4, discovered check, queen takes b3, and knight takes b3, black is down a piece with only one pawn to show for it. So what a variation that was, calculated by Bobby Fischer and apparently by Donald Byrne as well, who after playing king to f1 probably expected to see it on the board, since knight to b5 does seem to be the only reasonable try for black. And apparently that was also the assessment of all the masters observing this game as it was being played, since they all thought Bobby Fischer was losing here. But it's at this moment that Bobby takes this game from the domain of the mere ingenious into the realm of the truly immortal, with an absolutely astounding move. Again, if you've never seen this game, pause the video, see if you too can play like a chess god, even if for only this one move, which is the unbelievable bishop to e6, a stunning queen sacrifice that rocked the entire chess world to its very foundation, and one that Donald Byrne does now accept with bishop takes b6. But before we get into the brutal repercussions of that, let me first show you a few alternatives and why they all fail. If queen takes knight on c3, then we have queen takes c5, d takes c5, and bishop takes queen, leaving white a pawn down with a terrible position. So if instead bishop takes e6, then we have a beautiful forced mate in 6 moves with queen to b5 check, bishop to c4, queen takes c4 check, king to g1, knight to e2 check, king to f1, giving black the chance to execute my all-time favorite mating pattern. It's one that everyone should have memorized. Knight to g3, double check, so the king must move to g1, and now we have queen to f1 check, defended by the knight, so rook takes f1 is forced, and finally knight to e2, known as a smothered checkmate, as the white king is boxed in by his own pieces. So bishop takes e6 is an absolute no-go. Bishop to b3 would run into the same checkmate. If bishop to d3, then knight to b5 counterattacking the white queen is actually working for black and winning, since white does not have that move bishop takes f7 check. So Donald's decision to accept the sacrificed queen with bishop takes b6 could be considered to be the best practical try. When in doubt, just grab that material and make your opponent prove it. Bobby now proceeds to do just that with his very powerful response, bishop takes c4 check. The king goes to g1, giving Bobby a tactical sequence known as the windmill, with knight to e2 check, king to f1, knight takes pawn on d4, discovered check. The king returns to g1. Now white could try rook to d3, blocking, defended by the queen, but then the bishop is captured on b6 with a discovered attack on the queen, who goes to c3 to try to maintain defense of the rook. But then knight takes f3, comes with a discovered attack on the queen, when white is just dropping too much material, since if he now captures on c4, then black actually has checkmate with rook to e1. So Donald just plays his king back to g1, the dreaded windmill takes a few more turns, with knight to e2 check, king to f1, knight to c3 discovered check, king to g1, after which we finally have pawn takes bishop on b6, attacking the white queen, who doesn't have a lot of options. If queen to c1 defending the rook, then there's knight to e2 check with the fork. If queen to d6, then after knight takes d1, queen takes d1, and rook takes a2. The threat of rook to a1 defended by the bishop is just devastating. White will either have to part with his queen or get mated. So what's tried in the game is queen to b4, counterattacking the bishop on b5, but here comes rook to a4, defending the bishop from the queen through the queen. Donald grabs a pawn on b6, the rook drops off to knight takes d1, at which point, if we pause and do a quick material comparison, we can see that Bobby has regained everything he's sacrificed and then some, having a rook and 2 bishops for his sacrificed queen, plus an extra pawn. So that's about 3 pawns worth of extra material, and when you factor in the sad state of White's rook here on h1, blocked in by the king, this game is as good as over. But Byrne plays on for a bit. We have h3, planning king to h2 so he can get his rook active. Bobby grabs the pawn on a2, and after king to h2, he grabs another pawn with knight takes f2. But Donald can't be bothered with pawns anymore. He needs to try to do something as soon as possible with his few remaining pieces. We have rook to e1. Bobby's happy to trade with rook takes e1 and isn't the least bit worried about allowing queen to d8 check, now played by Donald, because he has bishop to f8 to block. Donald recaptures with knight takes e1. Now he's only got his knight and queen to work with. Is he hoping by some miracle that Bobby will allow his knight to make its way to d7 and win that pinned bishop on f8? Probably not. From what I've read, it sounds like Donald Byrne just wanted to play the game out as a courtesy to Bobby so that he could finish off his masterpiece with checkmate. We have bishop to d5 eyeing the g2 square, which is also under scrutiny by the rook as well. The knight goes to f3, allowing further simplification with bishop takes f3, which is of course winning for black. But Bobby opts for knight to e4 instead, which is also crushing, probably looking to play king to g7, followed by bishop to d6 check, defended by the knight. Donald responds queen to b8, attacking the b7 pawn, while preparing to meet king to g7 with an annoying queen check from e5. So Bobby just pushes the pawn to b5. Donald now pushes his h-pawn. It doesn't threaten anything, but Bobby stops it in its tracks anyway with h5. Donald plays knight to e5, just inching one move closer to winning that pinned bishop on f8. But Bobby now just breaks the pin with king to g7, now threatening bishop to d6. Donald can see that coming and plays king to g1, getting off that dangerous diagonal, but unfortunately stepping onto an even worse one, along which Bobby now delivers check with bishop to c5. And this is actually a forced mate in 8 moves, although the engine has been seeing a forced mate on the horizon ever since that last pair of rooks was traded. Now king back to h2 would be how White can survive the longest, but Donald just came from there. He doesn't want to go back, so he tries king to f1. Giving Bobby checkmate in 5, which he executes nearly flawlessly, making it a mate in 6 as follows. Knight to g3 check, king to e1, bishop to b4 check. Rook to e2 check was actually how to force mate one move sooner. But from here we have king to d1, bishop to b3 check, king to c1, knight to e2 check, king to b1, knight to c3 check, king to c1, and rook to c2 checkmate. Bringing to a close the so-called game of the century, one of the greatest Bobby Fischer has ever played, and one that put the entire chess world on notice. This was not just another prodigy. Bobby Fischer's ascent had already begun, and it wouldn't stop until he had achieved a legendary status that many consider to be unrivaled to this very day. So thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content, please like the video, consider subscribing, leave a comment. All those things help the channel grow, and I will see you next time.